Now, the pylon gateway would have taken you, as I said before, into that colonnaded area, and sometimes this was called a hypostyle hall. A good example is the hypostyle hall at the Temple of Amun-Re. And so this would sometimes consist of two large columns in the center, so a large row of columns that would be higher than the side columns. So that way it would raise up the roof and create a little open area called a clerestory there at the top, where sun could kind of shine through on the worshipers who were walking through that day. So that was, especially at the Temple of Amun-Ra, which was a solar deity, it was a good way that the visitors could kind of connect with their god in the temple that day. Now, we've looked at a lot of temples and sort of more wealthier architecture, but also the common people had to have a place to live too. So domestic architecture, sadly we don't know too much about it today, just because a lot of the materials that were used to create it weren't as lasting as the stonework and other materials that were used to create those large temples. So a lot of it has worn down with time, but we do have a pretty good idea of that the type of house you would have would depend on probably your class in society. So the lower class, or probably the poorest individuals, would have probably single-room homes made out of either mud or brick material, and these sometimes would often not have windows, so probably not too comfortable living conditions. However, as you went up the scale, the wealthiest homes were usually 2 stories. So the bottom floor would be for guests, and then the middle floor would be for families or relatives staying in the home. And then the top floor would also be for families, so on the roof they could kind of go to get away from the heat, maybe even to sleep on in the summer nights. And sometimes these houses would actually surround central courtyards or gardens as well. Now, we talked about a couple big elements of Egyptian art, the sculpture and the architecture. But there are also some minor arts, which the Egyptians probably valued more for their functional purpose, or that aren't really highlighted as major artworks from ancient Egypt. And these include elements such as jewelry or pottery. So I'll start by talking about jewelry, which would have been worn by many Egyptians, and the type of jewelry you had, so how elaborate it was, what materials it was made out of, would really be a good symbol of your wealth and status in society. So for this example, I have a lot of jewelry pieces from the tomb of King Tut, which of course are very elaborate because he would have definitely had the wealth to pay for them. And these are a good example of the craftsmanship that the Egyptian artists would have, that we don't always get to see from portraits or sculptures of individuals, because a lot of these gemstones that they would use would be difficult to carve. So with these smaller pieces, we get to see really their full creative potential and effect. And one popular gemstone was turquoise, which was really valued by the wealthy. But if you couldn't afford turquoise, there was another alternative, which was faience, which is sort of a glazed ceramic material that would have the look of turquoise, so that same kind of color, but it was a lot easier to mold, so it was easier to produce and more readily available as well. And then as we see through a few of these pieces, gold was also very popular among the wealthy, and gold would have been imported by Nubia for the jewelry pieces. Now, another thing that could sometimes be considered jewelry are these amulets, which are wonderful objects produced by the Egyptians to symbolize some sort of protection. And amulets could have either been of gods or goddesses, or either magical symbols also. And they were worn by the wearer with the hopes that they would protect the individual wearing them from whatever the god of the amulet was supposed to protect or represent. For instance, wearing an amulet of the goddess Bastet, who is the goddess of the house and the home, was believed to help your home and maybe help your domestic situation as well. So these amulets, as we can see from this slide, come in all shapes and sizes and are made out of all sorts of different materials. And sometimes they were even put on mummies as well, so both for the living and the deceased were these amulets. Now, some other decorative elements which wouldn't have been worn, and we don't really know that they had a major functional purpose in ancient Egypt. For instance, this grape cluster over here from the Amarna period was probably just something that would have been set on a windowsill. It's made out of faience. And the creator, when making it, might have been thinking about the idea of the autumn and how the sun would help produce these fruits. So in creating this, maybe give some sort of reverence to the autumn as well. And then next to it, that image of the blue hippopotamus. We see a lot of these blue hippos in ancient Egypt, and these are usually made out of faience, and they were sort of like from the hippopotami that would have lived in the Nile River. So people who had to work and live by the Nile River would have been very fearful of these hippopotami because they were very feared creatures. I wouldn't want to run into a hippo on the Nile if I was walking out there. But these hippos, they would have their legs smashed off, which would symbolically disable them with the hopes that it would keep any hippopotami from attacking the owner of this hippo. And we see the blue color and also the papyrus that are kind of painted onto the hippo just symbolize sort of the habitat that he would have existed in. Now there's also some functional pieces that we might consider more decorative today, but that really had a functional purpose in ancient Egypt as well. Pottery, which I mentioned before, is a big topic in ancient Egypt. We can tell what time period the pottery was from, a lot of times just by looking at the style. For instance, this oldest vase over here on the left-hand side would have been from the pre-dynastic period, and you can tell that just by the black rim, which is around the top of the vase. And then going from that to a newer element of Egyptian pottery, which would have been this Roman glazed jar from the Roman period of Egypt. So you can just see with the different styles and the different time periods, it's really just reflective of where these pottery pieces came from. And then the pottery could have been used to hold all sorts of different things, from myrrh to beer, anything that really the Egyptians needed it for. So it was very important in Egyptian culture, as well as looking pretty today when we look at it. On the right-hand side, we see a funerary bed from the tomb of King Tut. So a lot of furniture, especially of wealthy individuals that we find left over in tombs, is very elaborate. And this bed, which was left in King Tut's tomb, was probably more of a decorative element, or also might have served as a bed for him in his afterlife for his ka to come rest on. And on the end there we see two gilded lions, which were again symbols of strength and that King Tut was a ruler as well. And so that ends our discussion of Egyptian art today. And so even though there are so many different pieces I could cover, it would be impossible to know all the little details of all the wonderful pieces of Egyptian art that they made. I hope that this slight brief overview has encouraged you to maybe do your own research and maybe find your own favorite piece of Egyptian art as well. So I'd like to thank you again for coming along on this tour today, and also I'd like to open it up to any questions that you might have about the discussion that we